Welcome back to Confessions in Quarantine. My name is Pastor Axel Kegler, and we're starting things off with the Ten Commandments, and in particular, predictably, the First Commandment. You shall have no other gods. This means that we are to fear, trust, and love God above all other things, which seems like a really simple task, right? You'd think that one would go pretty easy with a baseline understanding. We believe in God, the God of Israel, the God who liberated the Jews from Egypt, who became incarnate in Jesus Christ, and who in turn defeated death, sin, and all that separates us from God in his crucifixion and resurrection. And by extension, we really don't offer any reverence to Zeus, Odin, Baal, Moloch, Dagon, Astarte, or any other number of really terrifying mythological pseudo-divine figures, pseudo-spiritual figures, which is cool by me, because those gods often are really weird and terrifying and terrible and unsettling. Odin, for instance, is well known for abandoning his warriors on the battlefield because he would rather be getting drunk with them in Valhalla before he raises them as this semi-undead army to fight his fight for him. We know that Zeus really doesn't respect consent. We know that Moloch worshippers would do really awful things to infants. We know that Mammon's a jerk, and we know that Baal is the Lord of Destruction from the Diablo series of games, and everyone knows that one really petered off after Diablo 2. To boot, none of these are the creator. None of these are the ground of being. None of them do quite what we confess God does, if they even exist in some form at all. So if worshipping God, and not the gods, were the bar of this commandment, it would seem pretty easy to follow. But it gets a lot more complicated than that. The commandment isn't really about supernatural entities. It's about a lot more than that. It's something a lot deeper than that. It has to do with who we are, with what we do, and who we trust. A god isn't simply a supernatural being. If divinity were about power, then this would be a very different game. This would be a very different thing. The most powerful figures in this world aren't divine. To have a god isn't simply to look at a supernatural entity. To have a god is to have someone or something that you trust more than anything else. And it is the human heart that creates gods and idols, not acts of power. The reformer Martin Luther noted that everyone is an idolater. Everyone in his period was committing idolatry. And that's not because there were Wodenist cults popping up all over the Holy Roman Empire. For Luther, in a very practical and very down-to-earth, day-to-day way, he observed that having a god isn't really a matter of having a supernatural entity whom you appeal to. Now, having a god, practically speaking, is having someone or something that you put your ultimate trust in. Look to the one whom you trust and hope will get you through the day. Look on the thing that you rely upon most. And it can be any number of things. That is your God. Before anything else, that is your God. If you put your trust in a person, in an institution, in something you've got, in something you do, that's your God, he would say. And that thing ain't God. We can turn just about anything into an idol. John Calvin, a little after Luther, argued very persuasively that the human heart is really at its core an idol factory. We can make an idol out of just about anything, because we can always find new ways to prioritize these things above our fidelity to God and our love of our neighbors. So, we can spend a lot of time talking about the different idols that come up, but let me just give a practical one that Luther talked about extensively here, and one that we see working very regularly today, because it's a situation that hasn't changed. Luther's first example of a real idol is money and property. Not just that these things exist, that's not really the problem, but rather how we trust them and how we relate to them. The Reformation period coincides with a period of really unprecedented economic development in Luther's home city of Wittenberg and the wider area. This period is in the middle of a real economic upheaval. Things are becoming way more profitable for Germany than they really ever had before. And a lot of Luther's Reformation actually ends up being bolstered up by that change in the economy. And Luther was very, very wary of this. He saw it as a very strange friend to have indeed, because he would see princes and the rising merchant classes really use money irresponsibly. He found them really starting to hurt people with how they treated employees, with how they treated the poor, and with how they treated money markets, actually. The early money markets, Luther found to be extremely abusive. So Luther's work, of course, is really on the ground level. It is dealing with this major economic stuff at the base, because people are turning their money and their property into idols. They are putting their first trust in what they have and what they can gain. They find themselves growing in this prosperity, but they find that that prosperity isn't really moored to anything. So they would buy land, and they would buy possessions. They could try to buy friendships and influence with princes, with kings, with emperors. They would try to land relationships with their superiors and entreat them for favors. And if they couldn't buy friends, well, they could buy armies. And if they couldn't buy armies, well, then at least they could buy guards. And if they couldn't buy guards, then perhaps they could buy the sheriff. Indeed, a lot of these guys, if they really wanted to, believed that they could buy time off of purgatory for the sins that they've committed along the way, so long as they put money into the right hands of the right archbishops or the right pope. Because money for them is what made their world go around. Money was power. Money was influence. Money could get you anything. The entire model of the medieval world could revolve around the use of money to get what you want. And as we know, often enough, it still does. Luther, like the many theologians before him, pretty easily observed that this whole way of life, that life is driven by possessions, that life is driven by money, by commerce, by all these things, looks an awful lot more like worshiping Mammon than following the crucified one. And it looked pretty clear to him that the people who were in charge of this model didn't look or act like Jesus. Lots of people, to this day, get bowled over by the promise of wealth. Whether it's economic opportunity, or whether it's lottery tickets, whether it's political activism, or whatever. A lot of the time we put our trust in making sure the economy works, be it a local economy, or a regional, or a national, or international one. We put our hope in markets. We program ourselves, and we think everything's going to be fine because we have this much money, or everything's going to be terrible because we don't have this much money. We put our hope in money. It's a really easy thing to do. To this day, there are folks who would rather risk the deaths of every immunocompromised person in the state of Pennsylvania than let a pandemic keep offices closed for a little bit longer. And for them, it's not really a question of whether or not it's a just system and a just order, that people will lose their homes or people will go without medicine. They don't question the market. They question our participation in it. And that, regardless of your opinion of what the market should be or how the economy should work, ends up looking like idolatry. Because it doesn't put God first. It doesn't listen to God's ways, God's commands, God's model of us relating to one another first. Here's the thing. I get it. These are scary times, and no one should be shamed or blamed for being afraid. We're all scared. It's scary not to go to work. We've been taught our entire lives that it's important to work. We put a lot of our personal identity and pride in what we do. I know I do. It's scary to not know where your next meal is going to come from. It's scary to have the idea that you might not be able to live in your house next month. And it's scary, perhaps scariest, to be afraid that you might not be able to have the medicine you need, or the medicine that your family needs to keep them healthy. These are scary things. The pursuit of them should never be obscured. That kind of stability and that kind of health should always be a priority for us. But who are we fearing more? And who are we obeying more? When we start to think about things in these terms, when our value, when our life, when our having a home depends more on whether or not we can meet the bill than what God is doing, than who God is, and when our system is created in such a way, we have to wonder who the system really prioritizes and who we are really seeking to fear and obey and love more than anything else. Who are we fearing when we won't fund or equip the helpers and the healers? Who are we obeying when it's all about what we can get and what we can keep? Can we not trust God to get things done? And can we not trust the church to help us along the way? Deep in our hearts, it is very easy to become afraid. I know I do. I'm a sinner. I need help. I need hope. Deep in our hearts, it's easy in these circumstances to be afraid, and in fact, a lot of people who aren't afraid are often being called naive or even idiotic. But who do we fear? Who do we obey and who do we love? These are heavy thoughts. But take that pattern of how we prioritize things, how we look at things, and how we try to get ourselves what we need. Take that pattern and start applying it to other things, and you will see the idols in just about everything. The way that we are trained to think about sexuality, for instance, in our wider world, it often ends up looking a lot more like Isis or Venus. The way we privilege honor It can make us look a lot more like worshippers of Mars or Thor. The way we prioritize cleverness and power might end up making us look like Baal or Odin. Perhaps even when we look at nature itself as the way things are, well, that ends up making us look like deists, maybe worshippers of Pan. It doesn't take much to look at what we value and how we get there to see that we aren't really always putting our trust and fear and love in God. Idolatry goes a lot deeper than aesthetics and worship. It goes a lot deeper than the supernatural. It goes to the human heart. In a lot of ways, our most insidious tempter isn't the serpent, and it's not some ancient god. It's what we want. It's how we act. It's the way we put ourselves first and the way we try to get what we think we deserve, as opposed to simply acknowledging that God is God and we're not. But we are still loved. We're still in this together, and we still need each other. When we start to think that all of this depends on us and who we are and what we do and what we have and what we need, the moment our world becomes centered around us, we enter into pretty profound danger spiritually. When we think it all depends on us having control and having power over one another, we start to get in real danger. And when we start to think that if we only have the right company and the right possessions and the right stuff, we're on the wrong path. Because that's not godliness. Godliness is something very different. The commandment to fear and love and trust God above all things is a call to defy the world around us, a call to defy ourselves. It's a call to stop looking here, start looking there and there. Not simply at God in some heaven light years away, but rather at God incarnate and crucified, God in the place we would last expect. But there's a lot more to go than just that. And I don't want to get ahead of I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot more to go over. But spoiler alert, this whole thing has a lot to do with forgiveness, grace, and repentance. There's still a lot more to go over, but that is lesson 1 on the First Commandment.